The camera rests on a single parchment leaf photographed under museum glass. The caption reads simply, Manuscript, Europe, dated 1357. The ink is dark, the margins are clean. The vellum shows none of the smoke damage, water warping, or pest erosion expected of an object that supposedly survived plague years, dynastic wars, and centuries of undocumented handling. Beside it, a museum accession note from the 19th century offers a quieter contradiction. The note reads, prior ownership unknown, no monastery stamp, no donor record, no confiscation log. In the same decade this manuscript allegedly crossed into modern custody, census rolls across Europe recorded sudden population surges of children with no recorded parentage, while cities unveiled stone infrastructure that no municipal ledger could fully account for. The manuscript appears calm, preserved, untouched. The question is not how it survived, the question is, what kind of world required it to survive at all? The British Museum manuscript catalogues from the 1880s present an orderly picture of medieval knowledge transmission. Page after page documents parchment codices, illuminated psalters, and philosophical treatises, each assigned a place in the great chain of European learning. The official narrative is comfortable. Monks copied texts in scriptoria, protecting them through centuries of upheaval until Enlightenment collectors brought them into public institutions. But the accession dates tell a different story. Between 1840 and 1890, European national libraries acquired medieval manuscripts at a rate that exceeds all previous centuries combined. The Bibliothèque Nationale de France added over 800 medieval texts in this period alone. The British Library logged similar numbers. So did collections in Vienna, Berlin, and Rome. This sudden surge in acquisitions demands explanation. The explanation offered is monastery dissolution, particularly the secularization policies following the Napoleonic Wars and the subsequent dispersal of monastic libraries. Yet when researchers cross-reference dissolution inventories with museum acquisitions, the numbers do not align. Hundreds of manuscripts enter institutional custody with no documented prior location. Their catalogue cards repeat the same phrase, provenance uncertain before 1850. The pattern extends beyond manuscripts. In the same decades, European cities unveiled Gothic cathedrals that municipal construction records could not fully account for, while census bureaus recorded sudden demographic expansions that immigration logs failed to explain. Each anomaly, taken alone, could be dismissed as archival loss or bureaucratic oversight. Together they form a constellation. What if these manuscripts did not survive continuous centuries of protection? What if they emerged from somewhere else entirely, a storage that preserved them not through time, but from it? The question unsettles the familiar narrative of unbroken continuity and forces us to consider how institutions may have shaped a reconstructed past. The year 1357 sits in the middle of Europe's catastrophic 14th century. The Black Death had killed between 30 and 60% of the continent's population by conservative estimates. Successive plague waves continued through the 1350s and beyond. Cities stood partially empty, monastic communities collapsed, trade networks fractured, the social fabric that supposedly preserved knowledge was being systematically destroyed. Yet manuscripts dated to this period survive in remarkable condition. Parchment analysis reveals minimal oxidation. Ink chemistry shows preservation profiles inconsistent with 6 centuries of atmospheric exposure. Binding structures remain intact in ways that suggest minimal handling. The vellum itself, prepared from animal skins through labor-intensive processes, shows no signs of the pest damage that should have accumulated across centuries of storage in pre-modern conditions. Contemporary chronicles from the 1350s describe abandoned scriptoria, scattered libraries, and the burning of contaminated materials. Whole monastic houses disappeared from the historical record. The documentary evidence suggests massive knowledge loss, not preservation. Yet the manuscripts themselves suggest something different, not survival through catastrophe, but protection from it. Modern conservators explain this through exceptional medieval craftsmanship and fortunate storage conditions. Perhaps some monasteries maintained climate-controlled crypts. Perhaps certain texts received special care. But the number of manuscripts exhibiting these preservation characteristics is disproportionate to the documented infrastructure that could have maintained them. The explanation strains when multiplied across hundreds of texts, across dozens of supposedly devastated regions, across a continent that should have lost far more than it saved. What environment preserves parchment better than time itself? Medieval manuscripts typically carry marks of their journey through history. Ownership stamps from monastic libraries, donation inscriptions from noble patrons, marginal notes from generations of readers, confiscation records from institutional transfers. These marks form a provenance chain, documenting custody from creation to present housing. But an entire class of manuscripts lacks these marks. Their margins remain blank where ownership notes should appear. Their flyleaves contain no institutional stamps. Their surfaces show no evidence of the annotations that accumulated on texts that genuinely moved through centuries of readers' hands. Comparative manuscript studies reveal the pattern. Texts known to have continuous medieval custody, like those at Monte Cassino or St. Gallen, show layered evidence of use. Different ink colors from different centuries. Marginal corrections in evolving handwriting styles. Binding repairs using materials from specific historical periods. The physical object becomes a palimpsest of its own history. The manuscripts that emerged in the 19th century lack this layering. Their evidence begins abruptly with a museum accession number, a collector's catalogue entry, a sudden appearance in an auction house. Before that moment, silence. Not the silence of lost records, but the silence of absence itself. When blank margins repeat across hundreds of texts, when provenance gaps appear in the same decades, when absence becomes the pattern rather than the exception, it stops feeling like documentary loss and starts feeling like something else. A signature, evidence of simultaneous emergence rather than continuous preservation. What were these manuscripts waiting for? Or more precisely, what moment were they prepared to enter? The acquisition logs of Europe's great libraries tell a story of sudden abundance. In the 1840s, institutions that had been slowly accumulating texts for decades began recording unprecedented influxes. Medieval manuscript, origin uncertain. Illuminated codex, prior custody unknown. Philosophical treatise, provenance before acquisition unclear. The British Museum's records show the pattern most clearly. Before 1840, sporadic acquisitions, mostly from documented private collections. After 1840, a flood. Manuscripts arrived from dealers who could not specify their sources. Texts surfaced in estate sales with no prior family mention. Parchments were discovered in architectural spaces that had somehow escaped previous surveys. Similar patterns emerge in Paris, Vienna, Rome, Berlin, and Madrid. Not identical, each collection had its own character, its own supposed sources, but the timing was synchronized. As if the same invisible archive opened across the continent simultaneously, releasing its contents into modern institutional custody. The official explanation focuses on monastery dissolution following the Napoleonic upheaval and subsequent secularization policies. Monastic libraries were indeed disbanded, their holdings were dispersed, sold, and scattered into private hands before eventually entering public collections. This narrative explains some acquisitions, but not the volume, not the timing, and not the simultaneous appearance across multiple national contexts. Dissolution records survive. They document what was taken from which institutions and when. Researchers have cross-referenced these inventories with museum acquisitions. The overlap is partial, at best. Hundreds of manuscripts acquired by major libraries have no corresponding dissolution entry. They simply appear, as if materializing from storage that left no paper trail. Collections grew faster than documented sources could supply them. The growth was not gradual, it concentrated in a narrow window, as if something had opened and then closed again. By 1890, the surge slowed. Museums still acquired manuscripts, but at normal rates, from traceable sources. Whatever had released those earlier texts had finished its work. While libraries were filling with manuscripts of uncertain origin, another system was processing humans of equally uncertain provenance. Foundling hospitals across Europe recorded massive intake surges between 1820 and 1880. Children arrived in numbers that exceeded any documented crisis that might explain them. The Paris Hospice des Enfants Trouvé logged thousands of admissions annually during this period. The Vienna Foundling House recorded similar figures. London's institutions expanded to accommodate unprecedented numbers. The intake forms repeat the same phrases: origin unknown, parents deceased, no relatives traced, found abandoned. These were not war orphans. No corresponding military conflicts produced casualties on this scale. They were not plague orphans. No epidemic decimated adult populations while sparing children. They were not famine orphans. Agricultural records do not support the necessary scale of catastrophe. Yet the children arrived year after year in numbers that strained institutional capacity. Census records from the same period show corresponding population increases that immigration logs cannot fully account for. Cities grew, but not through documented migration. Birth registries showed upticks, but not the necessary prior adult populations to produce them. The demographic mathematics failed to resolve. The parallel to manuscripts is striking. Both systems processed unprecedented influxes of entities without clear prior custody. Both received objects and people that should have had documented histories, but did not. Both recorded surges that concentrated in the same narrow historical window. Individually, orphan surges could be explained through archival loss. Perhaps records were destroyed, perhaps documentation practices were inconsistent. But the scale and synchronicity trouble simple explanations. Foundling hospitals across different national systems with different record-keeping traditions all reported the same pattern. Missing lineage concentrated in the same decades. What if preservation followed people, not shelves? What if the manuscripts and the orphans were part of the same event, a reintroduction of both knowledge and population into a world that had somehow emptied? Municipal construction records from the 19th century contain another category of mystery: infrastructure that appears maintained rather than built. European cities possess stone cathedrals, bridges, sewage systems, and public buildings whose construction dates are documented, but whose construction processes remain strangely underdocumented. The official histories describe these structures as products of medieval building programs, centuries of slow accumulation, gradual expansion, generational projects that outlasted their original planners. Yet when researchers examine construction ledgers, they find something odd. Extensive records of maintenance and repair, but sparse documentation of original construction. The Cologne Cathedral supposedly took over 6 centuries to complete, from 1248 to 1880. Construction records detail the 19th century completion work extensively. Every stone purchased, every worker paid, every engineering challenge documented. But the earlier centuries, the evidence becomes fragmentary, inconsistent, impossible to verify against the physical structure that exists. The same pattern appears across European cities, structures whose style and engineering suggest medieval or early modern construction, whose official histories claim continuous building over centuries, but whose physical evidence and documentary trails do not align with slow accumulation. Instead, they suggest something already present, being maintained, being adapted, being finished, but not being originated. Architectural surveys from the period reveal another detail. Many of these structures show signs of abandonment before their documented 19th century renovations. Not abandonment as decay, but abandonment as disuse. Spaces that were structurally sound, but empty. Buildings that needed minor repairs, not major reconstruction. Infrastructure that seemed to have been waiting. The cities themselves felt inherited rather than built, as if European civilization had moved into structures prepared by someone else, adapting them, claiming them, writing new foundation myths for spaces that predated the official chronology. Maintenance implies inheritance, and inheritance implies a prior inhabitant. When manuscripts are subjected to spectroscopic analysis, their ink reveals chemical fingerprints. Medieval inks typically used iron gall formulas, mixtures of tannic acids and iron salts that darken through oxidation. Over centuries, this oxidation continues. The ink ages, it corrodes the parchment, it develops characteristic degradation patterns. But some manuscripts dated to medieval periods show oxidation profiles inconsistent with their supposed age. Their ink chemistry suggests minimal atmospheric exposure. The degradation patterns more closely match sealed storage than open use. Not perfect preservation, these are not forgeries written yesterday, but preservation beyond what natural aging should permit. Modern conservators note these anomalies but struggle to explain them within conventional frameworks. Perhaps exceptional storage conditions, perhaps unusual ink formulas, perhaps climate factors we do not fully understand. Each manuscript with anomalous chemistry gets its own just so story, its own special pleading. The problem multiplies when researchers examine entire collections rather than individual texts. The anomalous preservation is not random, it clusters. Manuscripts with uncertain provenance before 1850 show disproportionately better preservation than manuscripts with documented continuous custody. It is as if the texts that lacked human handling also lacked exposure to the atmosphere that ages organic materials. Sealed storage preserves documents far better than any medieval monastery could. Modern archival science understands this: controlled temperature, stable humidity, minimal light, reduced oxygen. These conditions slow decay dramatically. But medieval Europe lacked such systems, or so the official history claims. What if the manuscripts were not preserved through history, but stored outside it? What if they spent centuries in conditions that should not have existed yet, and emerged only when the modern institutions capable of understanding their preservation were established? The world being sealed, then reopened, the timeline having a gap we are not supposed to notice. Library acquisition maps reveal a disturbing synchronicity. When researchers plot manuscript appearances across Europe and North America, the timeline shows concentrated clustering, not gradual accumulation, punctuated emergence. The 1840s saw a sudden influx across multiple cities. The 1860s saw another wave. The 1880s saw a final surge, then normalization. The pattern extends beyond manuscripts. Foundling hospital intake peaks align with library acquisition peaks. Census anomalies appear in the same years. Architectural surveys document similar timing for when medieval structures were supposedly rediscovered, renovated, and brought into modern institutional awareness. In 1851, London's Great Exhibition showcased technological marvels housed in the Crystal Palace, a structure built in months that seemed to exceed contemporary engineering capabilities. The same year, European foundling hospitals logged record numbers of unprovenanced children. The same year, major libraries reported exceptional acquisitions of medieval manuscripts. Coincidence strains under this weight. Across the Atlantic, similar patterns emerge. The 1876 Centennial Exhibition in Philadelphia unveiled structures whose scale and sophistication seemed to exceed the supposed capabilities of a young nation still recovering from civil war. American orphan trains began moving children westward in massive numbers, distributing unprovenanced youth to populate territories where demographic records showed impossible growth rates. By the 1890s, another cluster appeared. The 1893 World's Columbian Exposition in Chicago presented entire neoclassical cities that official histories claim were built in months and demolished after the fair. Yet photographs show permanent structures, infrastructure that suggested prior existence rather than temporary construction. The same years saw final surges in manuscript acquisitions and orphan distributions before both systems normalized. Independent explanations for each phenomenon exist. Considered separately, each could be accounted for through period-specific factors. But the synchronicity crosses borders, systems, institutions. Events that should not correlate, library acquisitions and orphan surges, architectural renovations and demographic anomalies, pulse together in the historical record. Coincidence collapses under repetition. Pattern recognition becomes unavoidable. Something happened. Something coordinated. Something that required simultaneous introduction of knowledge artifacts, human populations and institutional frameworks to process both. Institutional founding dates cluster in the same period as the anomalies. National archives, public museums, vital statistics registries, census bureaus, foundling hospital systems, the modern apparatus for documenting reality, all coalesce in the decades between 1800 and 1900. Before this period, documentation was fragmentary, local, inconsistent. After it, modernity's paperwork begins in earnest. Birth certificates, death records, property registries, institutional accessions, the systems that would make future disappearances difficult, all snap into place during the same window when the manuscripts, orphans, and architectural mysteries appear. A theory emerges, disturbing in its economy. What if there was a civilizational interruption? A period when human population declined catastrophically, not through war or plague as recorded, but through some event that left the infrastructure intact while removing the inhabitants. And then repopulation. Reintroduction of people and knowledge into a world that stood empty, preserved, waiting. This theory is not proven. It cannot be proven from the evidence available. But it explains multiple anomalies simultaneously. Why manuscripts show minimal handling but excellent preservation? They were stored, not used. Why foundling hospitals processed children without documented parents? The prior generation was absent. Why cities possessed infrastructure without construction records? It was inherited, not built. Why all these phenomena synchronized? A coordinated repopulation required simultaneous introduction of people, knowledge, and institutional documentation. The idea is disturbing, not because it claims certainty, but because it offers explanatory power that orthodox histories lack. Official narratives require accepting dozens of unrelated coincidences. The reset hypothesis requires accepting one major discontinuity. The nature of that discontinuity remains speculative. What caused it, how long it lasted, what happened to the previous inhabitants, these questions remain open. Census records begin in earnest around 1800. Before that, estimates, fragments, guesswork. Birth and death registries institutionalize in the same period. It is as if documentation systems were being established not to continue tracking populations but to begin tracking them again. Creating paperwork for people who had just arrived, backdating their histories, establishing lineages that could not be verified because the verification systems were being invented alongside them. The word census carries that implication, and the rise of institutional documentation matters. The simplest explanation is not always the safest. Return to the manuscript, photographed under museum glass. The caption read, dated 1357. But that date represents attribution, not documentation. The parchment was assigned to 1357 based on script analysis, stylistic comparison, and linguistic features. The date was inferred, not recorded, because no contemporary documentation traveled with the object. The manuscript's first photographed appearance occurs in the 1880s in a museum catalogue. Before that, silence. The ink that should be 6 centuries old shows preservation inconsistent with continuous exposure. The margins that should contain centuries of ownership marks remain blank. The vellum that should show handling wear appears pristine. The appearance raises questions about preservation. What if this manuscript was not preserved through history, but for history? What if it was stored in conditions that halted aging, then introduced into the 19th century, alongside the institutional frameworks capable of cataloguing it? Not a survivor of continuous tradition, but an artifact of transition from one phase of civilization to another, across a gap we are not supposed to see. This interpretation reframes everything. The manuscript becomes evidence not of medieval knowledge surviving plague and war, but of a library being restocked. The carefully preserved text, the minimal handling, the sudden appearance in modern custody, these are not signs of miraculous survival. They are signs of strategic reintroduction. Anchors imply drift. If this manuscript serves as an anchor, a fixed point allowing the construction of medieval chronology, then its presence implies the civilization it supposedly documents drifted away. It was interrupted. It required re-anchoring through objects like this one, strategically placed to support a narrative of continuity that masks discontinuity. The glass case that protects the manuscript also isolates it. Behind the barrier, the parchment exists in controlled conditions, stable temperature, minimal light, and reduced oxygen. This is the kind of preservation that extends indefinitely. It is the kind of preservation the manuscript seems to have already experienced before entering modern custody. Perhaps it waited in similar conditions for centuries we cannot account for. It waited for institutions capable of receiving it. It waited for a civilization ready to inherit what it contained. The word "waited" marks the possibility of deliberate timing and selective introduction. And when that moment arrived, in the decades around 1850, it emerged along with thousands of other manuscripts into museums that were themselves being founded to house such things. What survives a reset becomes an anchor. But what defines the reset remains unknown. Census records claim to track descent. Family trees branch backward through generations, linking present populations to documented ancestors. But when researchers attempt to trace these lineages beyond the mid-1800s, the trails disintegrate. Not gradually as records degrade, but abruptly, as if hitting a wall where documentation systems simply cease. Surname distribution studies reveal anomalies. Family names that supposedly existed for centuries show concentrated geographic distributions that do not match historical migration patterns. It is as if names were assigned to populations rather than inherited through continuous lineages. Genealogical depth may be shallower than claimed, a few generations disguised as many through institutional record-keeping that backdates its own reliability. The orphan waves provide a mechanism. Children without documented parents enter foundling systems, receive names, and eventually marry and produce their own families. Within 2 generations, their descendants possess normal family trees, except the roots are fabricated, assigned by institutional processing rather than biological inheritance. Scale this across thousands of children across multiple decades across every major European city, and entire populations emerge whose genealogies cannot be traced beyond a specific temporal threshold. Who were we before the paperwork? That question haunts demographic research that pushes past 1800. The sources become unreliable, contradictory, or absent. Not because medieval record-keeping was uniformly poor, it was not. Rather, something interrupts the chain. The people documented in 1900 cannot be reliably connected to the people documented in 1700. The system reboots somewhere in between. This creates profound existential uncertainty. Identity built on records that begin abruptly. Descent replaced by assignment. Heritage claimed but not verifiable. The crisis is not purely individual. Any given family might have continuous records. But statistically, the population shows genealogical discontinuity that should not exist if civilization developed continuously. What it means to be European, to claim regional ancestry, to identify with historical populations, all of this becomes unstable if the populations are not actually continuous. If 1800 represents not continuation but reintroduction, if the people filling European cities in the 19th century were not the descendants of medieval inhabitants, but their replacements, given names and narratives that connected them to a past they did not actually inherit biologically, genealogy becomes mythology, family trees become useful fictions, and the question of actual descent, who we really came from, remains unanswerable because the documentation required to answer it was created by the very system that performed the replacement. Museum plaques present confident timelines. Plaques often read 12th century cathedral, continuously maintained, medieval manuscript, monastic origin, ancient foundation, modern restoration. The narratives assume continuity, objects and institutions persisting through unbroken centuries, surviving chaos through protection, reaching modernity through endurance. But confidence itself becomes evidence when examining how these narratives are constructed. The plaques do not say, "we think" or "evidence suggests." They state, they claim certainty about periods whose documentation is fragmentary at best. They project modern institutional authority backward across centuries where such authority did not exist. This projection serves a function. Institutions stabilize reality through narrative. Museums do not just house objects, they contextualize them, they explain them, they tell the stories that transform raw artifacts into meaningful heritage. When those stories claim unbroken continuity from medieval to modern, they are not necessarily lying. They are providing the framework that allows present civilization to feel rooted, legitimate, continuous. But what if the continuity is manufactured? What if the timeline presented on museum plaques is not documentation of what happened, but construction of what must have happened for present reality to make sense? The artifacts are real, the dates assigned to them may be accurate, but the narrative connecting them, the story of continuous preservation, unbroken custody, survived catastrophe, may be institutional storytelling designed to paper over gaps that would otherwise destabilize civilizational self-understanding. Consider what it would mean to admit discontinuity. To acknowledge that sometime between 1700 and 1850, something interrupted European civilization on a scale that required repopulation, reintroduction of knowledge artifacts, and reconstruction of institutional memory. The implications would be catastrophic for legitimacy. Property claims rest on inheritance. National identities rest on continuous occupation. Institutional authority rests on unbroken tradition. Admitting the gap would undermine all of this, so instead, the gap gets filled with confident narratives supported by carefully contextualized artifacts. The manuscripts become evidence of survival rather than evidence of storage. The orphans become victims of normal historical circumstances rather than products of demographic replacement. The architecture becomes testament to medieval engineering rather than inheritance of prior construction. Institutions may stabilize reality rather than record it. And if stabilizing reality requires confidently asserting continuity across a period that was actually discontinuous, then institutional narratives become necessarily misleading, not through malice, but through function. The museum plaques are not lying, they are performing the work of civilizational coherence, providing the stories that prevent populations from recognizing the gaps in their own past. Trust becomes architecture too, and like the inherited buildings, it rests on foundations we cannot verify. The camera returns to the manuscript under glass. The ink remains dark against pale vellum. The margins remain silent. No ownership stamps, no custodial marks, no evidence of the centuries it supposedly traveled through. A small placard beside the display case offers minimal information, origin uncertain. Perhaps it is simply a miracle of preservation. Medieval craftsmanship combined with fortunate storage conditions, surviving plague and war through protective custody in some forgotten monastery, eventually surfacing in the archival abundance of the 19th century, along with thousands of other texts that followed similar paths. Or perhaps it is something else entirely. If this manuscript did not survive history, but instead waited for it, then everything changes. The document becomes evidence not of the past it supposedly comes from, but of the transition into the past we are allowed to remember. An artifact not of continuous medieval civilization, but of civilizational reconstruction. Carefully preserved, strategically introduced, narratively contextualized to support a timeline that masks discontinuity. The same interpretation applies to the foundlings whose intake logs show impossible numbers without documented crisis, to the cathedrals whose construction records cannot account for their existence, to the census gaps, surname distributions and demographic impossibilities that cluster in the decades when modern documentation systems were being established. If history was reset, and that remains hypothesis, not proof, then survival is not heroism, it is selection. And what was selected was not people, but templates, knowledge artifacts to reconstruct intellectual tradition, infrastructure to house reintroduced populations, institutional frameworks to document their arrival and obscure the absence that preceded it. What was left behind? The question haunts every confident museum timeline. If objects were preserved and people were replaced, then the civilization we inhabit may be authentically descended from the civilization that built these structures, copied these manuscripts, and established these traditions. Or it may be something else, a reconstructed civilization given authentic artifacts, placed into inherited infrastructure, provided with narratives that connect it to a past it did not actually live through. The manuscript offers no answers. It sits behind climate-controlled glass, preserved by the same systems that supposedly preserved it for 6 centuries before modern conservation existed. The ink that should have aged continues not to age. The parchment that should show handling remains pristine. The margins that should document custody remain blank. Perhaps we are inhabitants. Perhaps we are inheritors. Or perhaps we are something more unsettling, beneficiaries of a reset we do not remember, living in a world that was prepared for us, believing a continuity that was manufactured, standing on foundations we mistake for our own when they may belong to whoever came before. The question remains, what kind of past are we standing on now?